Thank you very much for the introduction and for inviting me. I'm really excited to be here and to share my research. Actually, I will kick off by saying that I feel very guilty. I saw Meredith using her iPad and I said, why didn't I do the same and print out my work? But it's not going to be, it's not environmentally safe and it's very old-fashioned, but it's not going to be wasted because I have a 3-year-old as well who is going to reuse it in a proper way. And Andrea has said pretty much everything you need to know about me. Just a few more words. So my background is in media study and I have a PhD in sociology, and this will explain pretty much my perspective on internet connected toys. I started, so I've always been interested in the social consequences and the social shaping of new technologies, but my work on children, and more recently very young children, started back in 2007, yes, 12 years ago, when I joined the EU Kids Online network as the Italian representative. And so this is pretty much my experience. And just so that you don't have to ask later what are my favorite toys now, it's again constructing toys, also because of my 3 years old. And also I fell in love with a preschooler app that I'm happy to show you later on my iPad, and it's made by a small publisher in Reggio Emilia. They create both books and apps for children, so we are very much into it, and I'll show you later. So given that I have the opportunity to talk for 60 minutes, which is really a great opportunity, and I hope I won't become boring at some point, just stop me if it is. And I will take the advantage to give an overview of how I started to study internet connected toys. So I will sketch out a few concepts from the IoToys book. Meredith also anticipated a little bit of it when she talked about considering IoToys as media. Then I will present recent work that I'm currently doing with Donella Holloway, Bika Zaman and Jackie Marsh in the UK. We did family case studies with this robotic toy called Cosmo, which is out there. I will set it up later for you. It needs to be plugged in and then connected to the iPad, very long. So the research project and the methods, some of you might be interested in the design of the research, the conceptual framework, and the affordances in practice of Cosmo, which is very much in line with scripted things that Meredith mentioned before. And eventually we asked what are the learning practices that children engage with when playing with these toys. So Donella had this idea to investigate the concept of robot literacy, and so I came up with this based on affordances, with this understanding of literacies in practice. So the background, we started studying the Internet of Toys within the Digility cost action. I don't know if you heard about it. It was a cost action that was chaired by Jackie Marsh, and it was concerned with the digital and multimodal literacy practices of young children. And within the cost action, I co-chaired working group. It's not work package. Working group 4, which was concerned with the shifting boundaries between physical and digital play. And so we said, okay, we need to study internet connected toys, but cost action do not directly fund research projects, and internet connected toys were not very popular at least in Europe at the time, and so we ended up studying the discourses and mapping the discourses, both the commercial and the media discourses around the Internet of Toys. And what we found at the time was it was what we called the Christmas season, so November, December 2016. And much of the media coverage was dominated by a campaign initially launched and coordinated by the Norwegian Consumer Council and then taken up by many other consumer associations in Europe and the US. So the, if I don't mistake, it's called the Commercial Free Childhood organization, yes, and they filed reports against the in front of the against this toy producer, which is called Genesis Toys, to both the European Union and the Federal Trade Commission for violating consumer rights. Basically, these toys had a number of safety and security problems. So they shared children's data. They recorded children's conversation with these dolls and robots, and they shared it with third parties without children's knowledge, which is not something different to what we learned that Amazon does with Alexa, for example. But the campaign was pretty much well coordinated. So what was interesting for me at this point of research into the Internet of Toys was especially how the social consequences of the Internet of Toys were framed. Because as it often happens with media representation, the representation was pretty much reductive, limited in a way. So the focus was on privacy issues, and the burden of privacy and safety was placed very much on parents. In most of the coverage. But especially within critical data studies, datafication is framed in a different way, in a more complex way. So I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the notion of datafication and critical data studies. I bet many of you are. For those who are not, the core idea is that everything we do in our everyday lives, and increasingly also everything we feel with empathic media and emotion-based technology, tends to be datafied, so turned into data, quantified, measured, and analyzed, so as to analyzed in real time, so as to predict future behavior. So within childhood studies, there was already at this time quite a rich literature on how the datafication of children's lives would have problematic consequences in the future. For example, Catherine Montgomery already wrote in 2015 about the dangers of forming digital dossiers of data that are provided by children themselves, but more often provided about children by their parents or peers or teachers or other adults they come in touch with. And this digital dossier, she argued, could impact on could shape the directions and future opportunities that would open up for children. So the basic idea is that these algorithmic-based governing could actually produce new discrimination in the way we access education, and especially children access education, but also job opportunities and healthcare and credit and so on and so forth. And another thing I was very much, and I'm still very much interested in, is not really the the long-term impacts in the way we access what are civil and social rights or political rights. But also the way that this datafication and quantification could actually influence citizenship imaginaries. So one of the key questions that but I won't delve too much into this today, that I keep asking myself is what happens when children grow up being used to quantifying themselves, to metricizing themselves and comparing their own performances with those of other children. And this, I think, is very relevant. And also what happens for children growing up used to being surveilled, filmed and constantly monitored through digital technologies, and they get used to it. They normalize surveillance culture as an everyday practice. But this is not what I'm talking about today, just to say that this issue of datafication is what led me approach the Internet of Toys mainly as media. So as Meredith anticipated in the Internet of Toys book, which came out last February and to which many colleagues and friends contributed, including Bike, and probably is Martin down there, okay, and contributed is we theorized the Internet of Toys, so IoToys as first of all toys. Most of them are also social robots, but our approach is to understand the Internet of Toys as mainly media. Because of the double and triple articulation that they have in children's everyday lives. So borrowing this idea also from, I don't know if you heard of Boons and Makel's book on the Internet of Things. They argue that being connected to networks and being equipped with sensors, IoTs become media in the sense they do not only work as interfaces for communication as channels for communication, but they also communicate in their own right. They collect a number of data from the environment, so they turn the environment into the surrounding environment into a datafied environment, and they communicate these data. So they, in a way, we could say, acquire new agentic possibilities. And so I'm not reading, better for you. And so what does it mean for me to understand IoToys as media? And I think we can draw on the definition of new media that Leah Livrio and Sonia Livingston wrote back in 2006, and they said that the new media and their infrastructure can be understood as comprised of different, of course, interacting layers. So we have the material or the digital material layer, which is the artifacts and the devices that enable and extend our ability to communicate. The communication activities or practices that we engage in to develop and use these devices, and finally the level of the social consequences, so the social arrangements or organization that form around the devices and practices. And if we extend this approach to the Internet of Toys, this means looking at the digital material assemblages. So both the materiality of the physical toys, as we will see, Cosmo is a physical toy, but also the materiality of the app through which we interact with Cosmo, for example. So the digital material assemblages and artifacts that enable connected play practices, but also to look at the the play practices themselves, which are sometimes at the boundaries between play and communication itself. Communication is at the core of play in many of these internet-connected toys, and when it comes to the social consequences, so the new organizational forms that develop around these practices, we can think of datafication and surveillance culture, but also to the idea of the increasing robotification of childhood, as Joachim Peter, for example, is currently researching, and he wrote about in the book. But the idea of looking at IO toys as media in this way so has some both epistemological and methodological consequences as well for my work. So in terms of themes and topics, as I said, I've already explored the issue of datafication and social consequences, but also it invites to look at practices and situated encounters between children and these digital material artifacts. So in terms of methods and epistemologies, it invites a sort of what we could call an epistemology of the everyday, so to assume the everyday as an analytical entry point into understanding, as Meredith said, the entanglements of data objects and practices in everyday life. What does it mean practically? That we do not, we in this way we are able to refrain from any temptation towards technological determinism. So it brings with it also a specific understanding of affordances that I will elaborate more soon. And it is within these reflections that we, and especially Donnell, designed the research project that we are currently conducting. Well, I was thinking that Bika and I already did the data collection, but we are still analyzing data. So I will present, it's just my preliminary analysis. And the project was funded by, sorry, let's keep with it a little bit, was funded by the Australian Research Council. It is a discovery project, so the main data collection is taking place in Australia right now, but then Donnell got funding also for some just in between 3 or 4 family case studies in Italy, Belgium and the UK. And when it came to decide how we proceeded, so the main question was, shall we go out there and look for families who already have internet connected toys and risk having many different internet connected toys to compare, or not finding enough families to participate in the study? We ended up by choosing an opposite approach, which was providing families with an internet connected toy, and we decided to go for Cosmo, a robotic internet connected toys, so that we could simultaneously explore the topic of internet connected toys, so the digital material assemblage, together with the social robotic thing that I will explain more. And sorry, this is in Italian because I haven't figured out as yet how to translate it, but except from covering everything. But I can show you later what it is about. So the research protocol consisted in 2 visits per family, and following these interests for digital materialities, we tried try to collect a combination of discourse-based methods, so interviews, and also observational and visual data, discourse-based data, sorry, and observational and visual data. So each family visit started with an interview with parents, where we interviewed them about their parenting practices, their perceptions around digital media in general, and their parental mediation practices. Then we asked children to show us their favorite toys. So it was a sort of play tour, and during the play tour, of course, they talked about their everyday lives, their favorite play practices. Most of them were actually very busy in after-school programs, so the time for play during weekdays were actually quite limited. And then the first visit ended with the Cosmo handover. So it was 2 researchers every family visit, and we brought 2 Cosmo as well, our own Cosmo, to show parents how to install the software and what were the basic functions, and then the Cosmo given to the children. This was the ideal research protocol. In practice, it was a mess. So I remember visiting a family at 7 p.m. and we found they prepared a buffet dinner for us, and so we had to improvise and do the play tour first, and then the interview with parents. And at the point, the children were there as well. Or the first family visit, our own Cosmo did not work. Apparently, it was only used to our to my office in the department. So when it was brought to a different setting, different light, it couldn't recognize me, nor my research assistant, and the connectivity was poor. A total mess. But as it always the case with research with children and families. In between visits, we involved the parents as co-researchers and asked them to film their children interaction with Cosmo. We didn't give any specific indication because we wanted them to be free to film what they deemed relevant, and even the routine, the everyday practices were important for us, so nothing exceptional. And the time between the first family visit and the second family visit was between 4 and 6 weeks. Which was enough for them to get familiar with Cosmo and incorporate Cosmo in their play habits. Not enough for us if we want to look at the longer term domestication, because then we know that many, at least in Italy, many of the children who were participating in the study actually did abandon Cosmo after the study. So, but anyway, during the second family visit, we did interviews with parents, and we engaged children in a co-construction activity of Cosmo's story in the family. And this is a screenshot of what they produced, of what one of the families produced, and it's done through an app, which I also have on my iPad, and I'm happy to share later, which is called the Book Creator app, which is also used in school setting very much. And the rationale behind using all this visual data was that this visual data could function both as stimuli during the conversation, especially with children. They are also respond to the ethical consideration of doing research with children, because you actually engage them in an activity which is meaningful and significant for them. They they spent a lot of time, for example, choosing the background color and the font style and whatever. And but they were also meaningful in terms of validating the interpretations that we were doing on the transcripts on the interviews. And these are the families that I interviewed, and the major limitation is that we recruited families via word of mouth, so they ended up being quite similar, but this is quite recurrent in research with families, that especially middle class families are more eager to participate in research. And as you can see, they had different interests, and we had a gender difference that I think is typical of Italian children. So still in Italy, it's still boys who are much more into video games like PlayStation, and we boys interviewed had PlayStation and Wii. The girls were much more into YouTubers and video stuff, but they were also much into physical interests and activities. For example, I'm sure you can help me with this, because it's either Swedish or Danish. What's it's called? It's like a small polar beads, yes, you iron them, and then that's it. They were very much, it's because of their mother. This is a family with 3 girls, and the selected, so we had a child in each family who was the owner of Cosmo, and it's the 8-year-old child, or 9-year-old in case of family 4, because Cosmo is sold on the market for 8 years old and above, but in the families where younger siblings were present, actually it was the younger sibling who was most passionate about Cosmo. The older siblings found it a little bit boring at some point. To be honest, we can speak frankly here. And the last child, for example, he was very much into Pokemon cards. And it was, as we will see, it was a very interesting case study, because his dad is actually a professor of physics in a Milan university, and so he likes programming very much. And last year he also handed to his son another programmable robot, but the son did really get pissed off and bored about it, and so this year he completely refrained from mediating anything. And this is interesting, because we will see that his child was very much creative in the way he used Cosmo. So this is just to show that what I did, it's a screenshot from NVivo. Not sure how many of you is familiar, probably many. So I did, which took ages, but I think it was really interesting. I did a line-by-line coding first, and then I tried to merge codes into upper-level codes. So these are the main themes that emerged from the interview. I won't say, and I'm not going to say that I did a grounded theory approach. We could argue whether this is constructing grounded theory, if you're familiar with Charmat's idea, because as you can see, there are a few concepts that were already in my mind when I approached the data. First, this idea of IOTA as media, and then again from a media perspective, I went to analyze the child-robot interaction as communication. And this is something that it's kind of new and not really new, but recent into human-robot interaction, a different perspective. So especially when it comes to children, most of the research conducted so far has been done with a developmental psychology framework and research toolkit as well. So the interest has been mainly on the cognitive and also emotional and also moral effects of children interaction with robots, whereas this study adopts a different framework and also different methods. As we have seen, it's not experiments, it's more kind of observation of children's everyday life. And the reason why we choose these to focus on children situated practices of engagement with robotic toys is that robotic connected toys are unsettling under many respects. So they are unsettling and remaking communicative practice, so generating the need for new kind of literacies, and this is especially true for social robots, so robots that simulate human interaction, and they interact with humans on an emotional level. So they interact with humans as if they were humans, or as if they were animals, pets, in a way. And especially this approach on robots as media comes from the emerging field of human-machine communication. It is an emerging field within media studies, to be honest, and it's they recently was recognized as not an interest group, but an interest group. Is it called an interest group within the ICA, the International Communication Association? And so it conceives of robots as media that enter a communicative relationship not only as channels and tools of communication, but as communicative partners. And to focus on child-robot interaction as a form of communication means that we are interested in the co-construction of meaning. So this idea is closely related to studies in STS, Science and Technology Studies, especially the work of Lucy Suchman on technologies and robots. So the idea that robots and humans engage in what she calls entity-making practices that are aimed at setting the boundaries between subject-object and sameness-difference, but they both participate in these relational negotiations. So this means that we do not isolate the way children are able to respond to the robot's behavior, nor how the robot itself reacts to the inputs from users, but we look at the way the entity of social robots is mutually produced and enacted by robots and humans in interaction, and the way they provoke one another and engage in a testing of liveliness. I'll show you some evidence in a while. The second key concept that I had in mind when I approached the data is the notion of affordances, that actually is closer to the scripted things that Meredith was presenting before. You are all familiar with the notion of affordances, and so you also know that in its not its psychological initial formulation, but at least its media and communication or sociological, is more of a sociologist formulation. I'm thinking of Hutchby. How do you say? I've always wondered. He's a British sociologist, anyway. He emphasizes how affordances have both a functional and a relational dimension into it. Let me quote directly from him. So functional in that they enable and also constrain the engagement in some activity. They shape the conditions of possibility associated with an action. Relational in that they may differ for one object in different contexts or between different species. So this means that they may also differ depending on the context and the children that interact in these specific contexts. So in other words, the functional aspects of affordances as a set of possibilities for action is always socially and culturally situated and variously actualized through material and social context. So while in Hutchby's definition in 2001 and 2013 again, affordances are recognized as the process that mediates between the functionalities of a technological artifact and their enactment in situated social practices. Its relational and processual nature has often been overlooked, and the term has been largely used as a synonym for functionalities in a quite deterministic sense, as intrinsic properties of technological artifacts, so affordances per se. While the concept of affordances in practice, which has been theorized, for example, by Elisabetta Costa in an article last year on New Media and Society, was developed to contrast a deterministic understanding of affordances as directing use and to foreground instead the ongoing and always situated enactment of the property of technological artifacts through practices of use in context. So depending on the context, affordances variously operate by demanding, requesting, allowing, encouraging and discouraging user practices, as Davis and Chouinard argued in 2006, and we can see that, for example, if we compare the Tamagotchi with Cosmo, as I studied the Tamagotchi in an article with Liam Berryman in last year in 2018, the Tamagotchi demands a certain level of nurturing. It demands to be taken care of, otherwise it dies. But not all the affordances, not all the internet connected toys demand care. They could invite, suggest, encourage. So again, this is not deterministic. And in this article with Liam, we argue that smart toys before Cosmo were characterized by at least three affordances. So there's their liveliness, the sense of animation that they provide. Also, as Meredith was saying before, they appear to have an agency on their own, to act independently of the user. But there's also a second affordance pretty much connected with this, which I suggested to call affective stickiness, which is a concept that we borrowed actually from feminist theory and a different kind of research. But the idea that they encourage children to emotionally invest on the object, and we know that children are used to project emotions onto their toys, be it soft toys, be it their toys, but it's the affordances of these toys that provide new scripts for emotional investments. They kind of require it more than a soft toy, in a way. And finally, what was typical of Tamagotchi but we couldn't find in the Cosmos, so I won't say it. It was another but let's go. And then similar to our to the notion of affordances in practice is the notion of literacies in practice. Because when I Googled for robot literacy on Google Scholar, I found these very narrow, from my perspective, definitions of robot literacy, and it's narrow because it develops on an individual approach to literacy as something that is individually achieved by a child. So it neglects the context. So as much as we have to look at the context and the situated practices when we examine affordances, the same goes for robot literacies. And if we look at the work, for example, by Jackie Marsh or Lydia Ploman into how children develop literacies through and around digital media, we know that there is a level of operational skills which we could argue is more similar to this individual achievement, though we know it's not. But then that learning through and about technologies also involved achieving disposition to learn and cultural understandings of the role of technologies. So we know that interacting with robots could actually provide children with understanding around the world, around the role of robots in our society, and this is why it is important to look at these case studies. So these are the affordances that I will talk about very briefly because I'm running out of time. I thought it was too long, but so liveliness is actually the main affordance that is also discursively constructed in Cosmo representation. So a gifted little guy with a mind of his own. And a personality that evolves the more you hang out. So the embodied learner is already in there, the idea of an embodied learner. And this is another screenshot from Cosmo's website. See, Cosmo doesn't just move, it gets curious and explores. It doesn't just learn, it plots and plans. It doesn't just see you, it gets to know you. So call him self-aware, call him almost human. So the liveliness is the driving affordance, and the interviews with children and the way children reacted, but also parents in a way, actually confirms this, that they see everything through the lens of liveliness, through the frame of liveliness. So Cosmo as a pet and an almost human. Cosmo's affordances are co-shaped by children who, in their play practices, enact the more pet-like or human-like affordances. So Father and Family Y, what she enjoyed more about Cosmo was making Cosmo perform human-like or pet-like performances. And there's a set of pre-programmed activities in which Cosmo can engage, like sneezing, laughing, and pretending he's angry, or singing, and whatever. And the children also recognized the idea of Cosmo as an intelligent agent whose skills develop through time. So the more he plays a game, the better it becomes. I also observed it myself when playing with Cosmo, and it is precisely this embodiment of human-like features and behavior, along with the embodied machine learning, that generates the impression of greater autonomy and agency, especially as compared to other digital technologies. For example, Luca compared Cosmo with the PlayStation. I must say that he was more into PlayStation anyway. So the PlayStation, and also according to parents, the PlayStation is more immersive and more enjoyable. But when he had to reflect about the differences or similarities, he says, well, Cosmo also does things on its own. So attributing a distinct agency to Cosmo. And I think I missed but anyway, let's see. And this is an example, a clear example of this engagement in entity-making practices where robots and humans test each other. Provoke each other and test each other. So, for example, we found this girl. She told us at some point, you know, I even tried to close his eyes, and I said, how did you do that? Well, you know, just covered the screen. You put your hands on it, but he even knew where to go and where the cubes were, because it is practically connected to the phone and to the cubes, so it understands everything. So they know the behind the scenes learning that they gain directs them to the more technicalities and the programmability, but still the liveliness framework prevails. And these entity-making practices, it's an ongoing process of mutual negotiation for which they try to make sense exactly how Cosmo moves in space, how Cosmo reacts to their inputs, and they mobilize both frameworks, the programmability and the liveliness, but again the liveliness tends to prevail, especially as we will see in making sense of the failures. But it's a clear example of how these affordances are actually co-shaped and co-enacted. Okay, so it is actually able to move by itself, but I point things to it. There's a feature that is called the Explorer mode, through which they can drive Cosmo. So, but there are occasions when there's a tension between the representation of Cosmo as a lively, intelligent agent and the actual technical performances of Cosmo. And it is interesting to look how they make sense of these failures, and they do so by projecting all the failures onto themselves rather than on the technology. So and also the parents did so, as in a way we are a kind of adhering to a framework for which technology is super powerful and is never wrong. So the same they did. So, for example, the Cosmo has face recognition, visual recognition, but it doesn't have voice recognition. If you want to interact with Cosmo, it's always through the app. So the children were speaking slowly to Cosmo to facilitate Cosmo understanding them. Or in this case, Cosmo, it was during the second interview, and we were playing with Cosmo, but Cosmo did not recognize her, and she was trying to make sense. What's wrong? I know what's wrong. I changed glasses and my hairstyle is different, so I should she had a ponytail. Okay, let's get rid of it, because the first time it scanned my face, I wasn't wearing the same glasses and I didn't have the ponytail. So it's like if natural interaction is natural face-to-face interaction is remediated through the lens of technology to make the interaction with Cosmo work. Or here they are making sense of why the voice recognition does not work properly. It's not because Cosmo is not equipped with voice recognition, it's because we don't understand each other. We speak mainly Italian, a little bit of English, but Cosmo is not is nor Italian nor English, is actually speaks Cosmese. So he's not able to understand us. And as I said, this also for parents, especially this dad is a technical engineer working for a telecommunication company for Vodafone, so his technical skills are very much developed. And but he and his son got very disappointed because they turned on Cosmo on the son's birthday, and Cosmo didn't even say happy birthday. So Cosmo did not meet the social expectation that we expect social robots or social agents to adhere to. Sorry, I'm going a little bit faster because I think it's I'm running out of time. And very much integrated with the affordance of liveliness is this idea of affective stickiness. So the feeding and nurturing Cosmo actually invites children to develop an affective bond with the toy. So some girls told us that they every night before going to sleep they passed by Cosmo and said good night, or the girls' favorite, especially the girls' favorite activity was to feed Cosmo. My Cosmo was probably starving because I found out that I need to feed it only from the children on the second family visit, so after 3 months, poor Cosmo. And so this idea of taking care, like, you know, more the Tamagotchi style, and as I anticipated, this was especially seen and perceived and enacted by younger children, younger siblings in the family. So you can see that for our youngest, it is a sort of a puppy. She would pet it, give it kisses, she's tickling it. And even though it is small and hard, it remains a little soft toy. So again, continuity in play practice rather than radical disruption, as Meredith was arguing before, or the house pet, which is more interactive than other digital toys. And then programmability, it was not enacted and taken up very much by Italian children. This is a national difference. We don't have very much coding skills into the school curriculum yet, for example, so both parents and children said it was a bit complicated or boring. For example, Luca is able to explain how it works, but he did not engage much into it. Actually, this is, if I manage to play it, why? Yes. Do we have just 1 minute? It's just to show you how it created a sequence out of, so there are 2 levels of coding. One is more advanced. This is the basic level of coding where you assemble a set of pre-programmed actions. And what was interesting from my point of view is that, again, the prevailing framework was liveliness. So he gets excited, and you can hear from this voice about Cosmo performing kind of human-like or pet-like activities.
Forse si deve anche questo
So he had just updated the app and found many new
Adesso sta notizie, che bello. Pensa, così pensa.
and immediately gets the meaning of it.
E adesso parla. Ok, vediamo.
It's not very skilled at it, as you can see. But,
Qua? No? Ho saltato tutto. Perché ho saltato tutto? Quando c'è la medaglia vuol dire che è felice perché ha vinto. Adesso lo saltato. Non so che fai il gatto, cosa bene? Perché sei girato di mano? Cosa pensa? Adesso parla con qualcuno. Abbiamo dovuto. Ha finito.
Ok.
Lo rifacciamo e vediamo perché.
Okay, and then it tries it again. But the thing is, he was he was very excited about the and now I'm okay. And but even those who were not really familiar with coding, they, I think and it's interesting about this notion of affordances, that it's not demanding and requiring activities, but is open to creative possibilities and creative uses. So this is this boy is the son of the professor of physics who was very much into coding himself, but he didn't even open the code lab, but he tried to make Cosmo perform things he was not designed to do. So he's designed to go on a plane surface, and he assembled like a ramp and decided to made Cosmo fly over this ramp. And this is something that his parents, for example, did enjoy very much. The idea that it encouraged creative thinking and creative play. So if we look very quickly, because I will only have 3 minutes left. Yes. So I mentioned the idea that technologies can help children learn through engagement, and also that in engaging with technology, children learn about technology and their role in society, and ultimately about the society in which we live. So learning through, as far as I could observe, none of them did really learn about coding, but what parents emphasized was achieving autonomy in play. At least initially they asked for their parents' help, because the app is only in English, and so sometimes they needed to ask for translation if there were words they were not familiar with, or for 5 years old they could not read. But then they achieved autonomy pretty soon, and they cultivated this disposition to make Cosmo perform things that it was not really designed for. But more generally, they started learning about social robots, so making sense of this robotic toy as a lively entity, as an embodied learner, and of these failures, whereby in making sense of the failures, as I said, both children and their parents were pretty much influenced by technological imaginary, which is also promoted by movies and fiction around robots as intelligent and super powerful. And so literacies were developed and negotiated and tested in enacting the affordances of Cosmo, and they were situated because they were actually changing and varying from one family to another. Thank you.